And here we are, one last time, with the stop-motion wunderkinds of the UK, Aardman. And while in the previous videos I've covered things with a particular theme of movies, TV shows or ads, this year I'll be picking up the leftovers that I've missed from all of those particular genres. So, with a lot to get into, we've got no time to waste, and since this is likely going to be the very last Aardmay, since there's not really much left to talk about after this video's done, I say, welcome everybody to Aardmay 2022. Oh, and for the record, Robin won't be in this month's selection since it hasn't yet been released on DVD, at least not at the time I've written this script. And that's even if they're planning on doing it, since DVDs have become more of a dying breed amongst the greater amounts of on-tap media now. So maybe I'll get to that one in the future, maybe not. But right now, I'm getting into the last Aardman property I said to get to later on in the last video. And that of course being Shaun the Sheep 2, Farmageddon. In my opinion, the ideal example of how to do a sequel right. So what's the plot to this one? Well, Shaun and his friends are getting on what they always get on with. But, unbeknownst to them, an alien spaceship has landed near the farm. Because, of course it has. That's the ultimate go-to plot device for a franchise that's run out of ideas, introduce space and aliens into it. And the pilot of which is a small alien known as Lula, and has made her way to the farm, and as expected with most kinds of aliens in this kind of story, she is very mischievous and childlike. And while she seems to have fun just sort of milling around on Earth, she also desperately wants to get back to her own family and planet, and as such, Shaun puts it upon himself to take her back to where his spaceship landed and to get her home. Meanwhile, the farmer, who I've now just only realised bears a bit of a resemblance to Greg Davies.
I mean, I'm never in the history of the whole show have I felt contempt for all of them.
Notices the hysteria and the UFO obsession going on amongst the town people, and since the alien has also just wrecked his combine harvester, decides to take advantage of this and set up his own quote-unquote theme park in order to raise money to buy himself a new one. However, it seems that the alien's presence has not gone unnoticed, as a rather inept government organisation, led by the determined Agent Red, and assisted by a robot buddy, are hell-bent on tracking down the alien. So as you can imagine with this sort of synopsis, it's basically your typical ET/Close Encounters of the Third Kind sort of story. In fact, Close Encounters of the Herd Kind might have actually been a better subtitle, but of course we all know something that already used that. So, it's not the most original story, which is a shame in comparison to the last one, which actually did have a very unpredictable story. But let's be frank here, Shaun the Sheep was never really about the story. Primarily what it's about is having good comedic setups and really good animation, particularly considering that Shaun the Sheep has always been an advocate of the classic silent cinema form of pantomime. Which this film still does in great effect. Possibly even better so than the last one was, but of course it doesn't really matter about all of that. What does matter is if the movie is funny, and I'm delighted to say, yes, it's very funny. I was admittedly rather anxious about the idea of this movie because I felt it was a movie that didn't really need to exist. The first Shaun the Sheep movie was a really good movie and, like I said, had a surprisingly unpredictable plot, some very good comedy, and probably out of all of Aardman's movies was the one that best represented that sort of small town British charm. So it did sort of feel like this was an unnecessary sequel and they were just making it to try and cash in on the fact that Shaun the Sheep is still very popular. However, I will admit that as a movie, it's really funny. In fact, I'd actually argue that in terms of jokes, it's actually better than the first movie was. The first movie definitely felt more like it was trying to get to you on an emotional level rather than a comedic level, and I do respect it for that, but I do much prefer Shaun the Sheep for its jokes rather than the emotional elements it brings, and this one I definitely feel had a better series of jokes and also had a lot more interesting setups for jokes. The whole alien fish out of water sort sort of idea of a character we've seen to death before, but this one actually does work quite well, and actually the lack of dialogue really does work to its benefit in that regard, since it means we don't get as much in terms of dialogue and it's all about the actions and reactions, facial expressions and body language. Plus the alien definitely does have a sense of personality about her. She's curious, rather headstrong, and doesn't really think about what she does before she does them, which actually makes her an interesting pairing with Shaun because often that's the personality he has in the group. Granted, Shaun does sometimes take the role of the responsible one within the group when the other sheep get out of hand, but he's often the first one to cause trouble in the first place, so having him paired with someone who gives him a run for his money is actually quite an interesting dynamic and leads to some good jokes. Also, it's interesting to see Aardman go into a more sci-fi route with this movie, since it's not something they've done all that often. The first that comes to mind in that regard is of course A Grand Day Out, which they straight up reference within the first 5 minutes, which in itself is kind of weird because Shaun the Sheep is supposed to take place within the same canon as the Wallace and Gromit universe, but it is a nice little reference and it's the first of many callbacks in this movie. It's also cool seeing the various references they pull out, like 2001: A Space Odyssey, Star Trek and Doctor Who. Seriously, the amount of Doctor Who references in this are off the chain, but they're all pretty funny. It is a shame that the other sheep and even the farmer don't get as much of the focus this time around like they did in the last movie, but we already did have a movie that focused on them and several series of a TV show, so it is nice to have some more focus on some newer characters, plus the actual main characters, Shaun and Blitzer, do still have quite a bit of screen time and are still the main focus, so that's always good. Speaking of the new characters, the main villain, Agent Red, is actually quite a decent villain. She's definitely got that Mrs. Tweedy vibe of being a very intimidating character, but she's not quite as memorable or interesting, although this time she's meant to be a little bit more sympathetic, so I suppose that's the reason why, but still, I think they could have done more with her. However, the character of the villain side that definitely brings more to the table is her robot buddy, Muggins, who, as I hinted at earlier, definitely has some strong resemblance to the robot from A Grand Day Out, especially with him having a filing cabinet within his chest area. I think it was a nice little callback. Admittedly, he's nowhere near as creepy as that robot was, though to be fair, that's probably all for the better. It does share some of the same flaws that the first movie had. While it is actually a very entertaining movie, it does start off rather slow and is a bit difficult to get into within the first half an hour, but if you stick with it, by the end you are completely sucked in. But for some kids that might be a bit of a difficult thing to do, so admittedly in terms of being a children's movie, it does fall down a little bit. But children do have more of a sense of attention than we give them credit for sometimes, so I do feel that they'll be able to stick around for when it gets really good. As I said before, this movie is definitely a lot funnier than the first one. Not to say the first one didn't have some good jokes in it, but with the fact that it was within the first 5 minutes we get a character who sees an alien spaceship, gets scared away by it, but is too obsessed with his chips that he can't bear to leave them behind. That is a very funny joke, and is also incredibly British. The only way it could be more British than that is if it was a curry. And yes, I know curries are from India, but I think we actually eat more of them in the UK than they do. We do still get some good heartfelt moments, and it's made all the better when Aardman's animation is just as good as it always is. In fact, it's almost more impressive here when you consider they're able to make the characters emote so well and show you exactly what they're feeling, despite being very simply designed and having no dialogue whatsoever. Admittedly, resorting to the corny pop song at the third act breakdown I think was going a bit too far.
What's it like to wonder why I do everything with you on my mind when...
But in spite of that, it actually is a really good heartfelt moment. Overall, the movie does feel like it's trying to be more funny than the first movie was, which was definitely trying to be more of an emotional movie, and I think in that respect, it was actually the best way to go, since there was probably no way they could top the emotional elements of the first movie, so probably best to go for a more funny angle with this one. I'm glad the movie actually turned out not to be a waste of time, and while there isn't really any kind of building of character and story from the first movie, Shaun the Sheep isn't really the kind of franchise where there's any kind of serialization or even a massive amount of sense of continuity. I mean, let's not forget, at this point in time in the TV show, Blitzer had a beard, and there's also meant to be a cat character, and they're nowhere to be found in this movie. So they definitely have more of that Looney Tunes kind of story element to it, where each individual episode, or in this case movie, is its own isolated event that happens to these particular characters. And as an isolated event for these characters, I'd say it's pretty good. Now granted, Aardman's next upcoming movie is set to be another sequel, and that's one I'm actually even more cautious about, because at least Shaun the Sheep is a franchise that shows that it can still keep on going even after all this time. Chicken Run, on the other hand, was a movie that had a complete story and a perfect beginning, middle and end, so I don't really know how you can expand on that. But I guess only time will tell what will happen with that. But now, let's move on to the next part of Aardmay. And so now, we move on to TV shows, and first we're going to be talking about the, shall I say, alternative style of Pib and Pog? Yeah, let's go with that. Pib and Pog started off as a 5-minute short by Peter Peake, who would go on to direct the second Robbie the Reindeer short, as I said before, and was originally aired on Aardman's old friend, Channel 4, back in 1995. The basic premise of Pib and Pog is basically being a spoof of a very young-orientated, and I suppose somewhat educational children's show, with the characters standing in a very blank environment and having very limited movement, and incomprehensible language, which is therefore interpreted to us by a very condescending narrator.
What have you been up to? You've been to the beach, Pog?
So it seems typical for the kind of stuff that you would see on CBeebies, but things take a different turn when you see the way Pib and Pog treat each other.
My Pog is in a playful mood.
That being the way that would not be out of place if Rick Mayall and Adrian Edmondson were substituted for these roles. So yeah, they are incredibly violent to each other, which, to be fair, it's not uncommon for children's shows to go violent with the way that the characters interact with one another, but not quite in this particular way.
Look out, Pog.
Yeah, something tells me you'd never see Shaun the Sheep breaking out an Uzi, although to be fair, if the franchise keeps going, I wouldn't be surprised if they did resort to desperate measures like that. I do always like it when people make fun of kids shows in a very dark adult way. Hell, what I'm going to be talking about next month is the absolute epitome of that, and while admittedly this doesn't go necessarily quite as far as something like, say, Robot Chicken or Happy Tree Friends, this can just be chalked up to the way that we British do our dark adult comedy. The darkness comes more from the subject matter and the dialogue rather than what is explicitly done on screen, and for the most part I think Pib and Pog work quite well in that regard. I will admit that the initial short does have its shortcomings, mostly in how the pace feels like it's really chugged down, and granted that comes from how they're trying to emulate the very slow pace of the children's shows that they're spoofing here, but it doesn't really help with the comedy in that it makes it feel like it's a bit tedious sometimes and the timing's not exactly the best. Plus the way in which Pib and Pog talk can be a little grating sometimes. But the ways in which they think of being able to one-up each other in mutilating each other can be very creative and almost kind of reminds me of Looney Tunes or Tom and Jerry. Granted, it doesn't quite go as far as even some of the most violent episodes of Tom and Jerry, but it's still pretty fun to watch. Not to mention, when Pib and Pog break character at the end of the short and start talking like old-fashioned Shakespeareanly trained actors is actually legitimately funny.
Okay, lovies, that's a wrap.
Thank goodness. I don't mind telling you, darling, I'm absolutely pooped. I don't expect Morph to put up with these kind of conditions. What a dreadful ham.
Even more funny now as an adult, considering that a lot of actual children's performers from my generation actually did have a lot of proper old-fashioned acting training, so it's even funnier to imagine that this is actually what they were getting up to when the cameras were off, and it's somewhat funny to imagine if this was actually a real children's show. Although apparently whoever at Aardman actually runs their YouTube channel didn't quite understand the joke, since these shorts are actually advertised as being part of the For Kids section of the website, which granted granted, the first short doesn't really go into too much in terms of adult content, but that certainly changes with some of the other shorts that they did a few years later. Yes, in 2006 they decided to make a few more shorts of these, shall I say, endearing characters, and while the first short didn't quite go into anything that was overtly adult, the more modern ones certainly break that barrier with discussing things like heroin, pornography.
It's a film about a donkey. I do hope that it's Muffin the Mule.
And something that no child or indeed any human should be subjected to. The X Factor. And these shorts are on the Aardboiled YouTube channel and are listed as being for kids. Yeah, someone at Aardman needs to check what's going on there. Although to be fair, with the Elsagate fiasco that happened a few years ago on YouTube, I suppose it could be worse. Even more upsettingly, the new shorts don't have Pib and Pog break character like they did in the end of the original short, which is really disappointing considering I think that was the funniest part of the original short. But they are still very fun shorts, and it's always interesting to see Aardman getting into more adult stuff. Admittedly, we've never seen them quite go all the way in terms of something you could see on Adult Swim, though you could argue that's probably for the better. But still, it is actually quite an interesting show. Not one of their best, I'll grant you, but it's certainly better than some of the other things we're going to be highlighting later in this year's Aardmay. But the next one we're showing definitely is something that is very funny, very appropriately enough. And now we move on to a show that I'm actually surprised I'm even covering at all here, since when I looked up that Aardman were involved with DC Nation Shorts, I just figured that they were a producer who were involved with making the series and were just helping out. But no, they actually did produce a series of their own shorts in their own style for this variety show. And I'm sure glad they did, because this is one of the funniest things I've ever seen them do. Appropriately so, because the actual series itself they did is called DC World's Funnest. Essentially, this is basically a return to their Creature Comforts format, with having a group of people, in this case all children, just give a random bunch of unconnected anecdotal testimonials about whatever they feel like talking about, and then inserting them back into animations about unrelated things.
I'm not really a sporty person. I can fly. I do running.
I don't know why he wears his pants over his costume. Maybe it's a fashion statement. He goes to karate.
However, in this case, they make it seem like it's the characters from the DC universe saying these things. This is already a really funny concept, as Creature Comforts has shown us in the past, but inserting them into very silly looking versions of Batman, Superman, or the Joker, it makes it absolutely hilarious, especially since they mostly got British kids to do this, as you would imagine. Though admittedly the guy who played Batman this year was British, and so was the last guy to play Superman for that matter, so maybe it's not that all weird. Even so, hearing these comments come out of the mouths of these characters, even if they're leaning into the comedy angle with having them look like that, is still a ton of fun, and it works because usually in Creature Comforts, the kids were the funniest part about the show.
My mum likes them. And I like them. We both like them. Lots of the superheroes wear masks to protect their identity.
It's also cool to see these particular characters done in Aardman's own style, but still done with their own particular flair to them. Like with the Joker looking like Krusty the Clown, and Batman and Robin, I'm not even quite sure how to describe what they look like unless they were trying to actually emulate the way they looked in Only Fools and Horses in a stop-motion form. Admittedly, I think the testimonials used in this series are a bit more scripted than they were in Creature Comforts, as they seem to refer to specific characters and circumstances that would only fit within this setting.
Hey you! Are you the Joker?
Which admittedly, I'm not really a fan of the idea of Creature Comforts having rehearsed testimonials, but in fairness, this isn't really Creature Comforts, it's its own thing. Plus, it does actually make them quite funny. The animation also seems a little bit different from Aardman's previous style. I'm not quite sure how to describe it, but the way the intro is animated has this very almost psychedelic feel to it, like they're not made out of plasticine anymore, they're made out of liquid. Looks really strange, but also really cool. The animation in the series itself is a bit more typical than what you would expect from Aardman, but I don't know, something about it looked a little bit different. I can't quite put my finger on it, but something about the motions and the actual shape of the various characters, something about it just seems a bit different, but I like it. Admittedly, I would have liked to have seen what they would have done if they had them look more like if they were in a serious DC show, so having them be more realistically proportioned and having them look more cool but still say these things like they were children. That would have been a lot more fun, though I suppose in a way that's what the Lego Batman movie was about, so I guess we did get that after all. I am so glad that Warner Brothers approached Aardman to do this because it's a really odd idea, but it really worked, and it's always good to see DC poking fun at themselves because they do tend to take themselves a lot more seriously and are less inclined to make fun of themselves or have a sense of humour about their own world. So it's great to see them actually willing to poke fun at themselves. But it's always good to see an Aardman show that is always really funny. Unfortunately, the next one we have on this year's Aardmay can't quite make that same claim. And so we move on, and unlike the previous show we talked about, this is a show that I actually did grow up with, though after rewatching it, I kinda wish that I didn't. This was a show that Aardman did for CITV, because of course it was for CITV, called Planet Sketch, and as you can imagine from a title like that, it was a sketch series. Unfortunately, like most sketch series for kids back then, pretty much every sketch had the same setup and the same punchline, which naturally gets very tedious very quickly. However, unlike the sketch shows on BBC, which were mostly just boring, with the exception of Horrible Histories of course, this is just aggressively unfunny. This was Aardman's first, and as far as I'm aware, only venture into CGI in terms of a television series, but while unlike in Flushed Away, where the CGI was not all that noticeable because they more or less just copied the same style from their stop motion movies, or Arthur Christmas, where the design of the characters' faces looked a little bit odd, but in general the actual CGI was very good, this show just looks ugly as sin, in that really creepy way that most 2000s CGI TV shows tended to look back then, which I've gone over before in some other videos, but basically CGI TV shows didn't start to look really good until around about the 2010s. As you can see with the characters, they are designed to look like Nick Park's Aardman creations, but with a slightly more exaggerated proportion to them, since they can get away with that since they don't have to make the models being able to support themselves since they're not in the real world like stop motion characters are, but still having that very Nick Park style face to them doesn't really blend well with the more cartoony proportions. Plus the reason that Nick Park's faces work with a lot of the characters is because they do have very stocky proportions, which makes sense because they need to be in order to support the armature within them. At least they did back when he started. Nowadays armatures are a lot more sophisticated, like if you see the Leica movies you can see that they are a lot more skinny and very cartoonishly proportioned, but that's a subject for another day. Here, when you see the characters have those really skinny limbs but still very rounded bodies and that traditional Nick Park face added to them, it just looks like a mess. That, and combined with the fact that the CGI is very poorly rendered, lacks details, and just has a very bad movement style, it just looks very unpleasant. But that's the least of this show's problems. All the sketches are incredibly unfunny. You name it, they all suck. The sketch about the girl who has stuff stuck up her nose, which is just disgusting. The sketch about the pair of horses with the young one who farts at the end of every sketch, which is also just disgusting. The silly problematic Japanese fighting fish.
Slow down. Don't eat too much if you want to stay fit and hard. Fit and dead-hard.
The ninja handyman, who is also slightly problematic.
Ha! Don't forget these! Ha ha ha!
The rapping hoodies, the spacemen, they're all unbelievably unfunny and they're just unpleasant to look at and listen to for that matter. The only one that ever gets a slight laugh out of me is the dinosaur doctor, because his sketches are one of the few ones that actually feel like they have a different punchline to them. The basic setup is a doctor who is a dinosaur who tries to find an excuse to eat one of his patients whenever one comes in, but for one reason or another they end up escaping, or just through their own naivete don't realise he's trying to eat them.
Aren't you going to scream?
My hiccups. I've been hiccuping for the last 2 days. And that little shock seems to have cured me.
No, Perkins, no. This patient is too full of artificial colouring. He won't make for good eating. Treating. Next!
This is actually a little bit funny. Not massively so, I'll grant you, but the voice acting from the doctor himself, combined with just how stupid some of his patients can be sometimes, it does get a little bit of a giggle at me. The rest are just absolute garbage, and quite frankly it was a waste of good animators, since clearly people working on this show had talent, but it just wasn't fully utilised. The only people who seemed to actually be doing a decent job out of this were the people who came up with the theme tune, because it is a legitimately catchy theme tune. But when one of the best things of the show you have going for you is the first 30 seconds, you know it's not a good sign. So this is probably the lowest point for Aardman in terms of their TV shows, possibly even more so than Angry Kid. And I know I got a lot of backlash on how much I said I hated that show, and if you like it, fair enough, but I just really can't get into it. But take solace in the fact that I hate this one way more, and I don't think there's anybody out there who'll say that they like this one. Although I may live to regret that, who knows. And it's a tragedy as well, because Aardman has proven time and time again that they can make things that are even shorter than this show, that have more character, better jokes, and are just better made overall. And we'll be getting into those next time. And now we move on to ads, and we're going to a company that Aardman has definitely had an affinity with in the past, Cadbury's, and this time we're talking about their cream eggs. Cream Eggs' most popular ad campaign has always been the rabbit who lays them, which is bizarre, but Cadbury have done much stranger ads in the past and future, and I'd actually argue this is one of them, where they do various ways in which people eat the cream eggs in relation to the star signs. Not sure what they were thinking of when they came up with that idea, but it does lead to some interesting vignettes, and I might as well just riff on each one.
Hi, I'm Leo. I eat the lion's share.
I've heard of werewolves, but were-lions? And they apparently like to eat chocolate. Although to be fair, that probably would kill a werewolf actually.
Aries, I give it a good battering.
Apparently, Aries also likes to dress like Del Boy, so shouldn't he actually have a Pernod and blackcurrant instead?
Libra, I like to weigh up the alternatives. Wait, hey!
I wasn't aware that the cat from Red Dwarf liked cream eggs. Is this ad just going to be having a bunch of cameos from characters from classic sitcoms and how they like to eat cream eggs?
Cancer, and I'm a shell man myself.
Okay, well that shoots that theory down, and I'll probably best skip this one before I make some horrifically offensive joke that I can't hide behind Huck in making.
Aquarius, and sometimes I get carried away.
But that won't stop me doing that for this one. I think you got the wrong studio, love. The food fetish set is next door. That's where they're filming Chocolate Bukkake 5.
Virgo, and this is my first one.
Same for you there, my dear. I think we really need to put the signposts up more clearly. Also, they totally stole that joke from Sabrina Online.
Capricorn, mind if I butt in?
That guy kind of looks like me, which is fitting I guess since I am actually a Capricorn, though I don't wear creepy sweaters like that. I get enough trouble with people telling me I look creepy, I don't need to add to that panache.
Scorpio, one nip from me and it's history.
Wow, even Shantae hasn't got hair whipping powers like that. Oh wait, hair whipping? Oh no, I'm getting Willow Smith flashbacks! Hopefully Will Smith doesn't punch me in the face for that remark.
Pisces, and I dive right in.
I genuinely don't know what to say about that one. Who knew fish could survive inside cream and caramel?
Gemini, and I like to slurp it. Bite it, slurp it, bite it.
Okay, this is getting a bit too sexual, even for me. Oh wait, was that the intention? To make it all just a bunch of double entendres?
Sagittarius, I could eat 2 or 3 on a trot.
Oh yeah, this is some sort of fetish video for somebody out there. Not sure who exactly, since I don't think there's ever a way you could make stop motion characters sexy.
Taurus, and I go at it like a bull with a sweet shop.
So you destroy it and leave it in tatters then? I suppose that makes sense. It's what I do to cream eggs. I can't stand them myself. In all seriousness, this is a very funny ad, though it is weird that they detach jokes like this to cream eggs of all things. Maybe they were working on this as a short film and then they got the commission for the cream egg ad and decided to adapt it for that. Either way, much like the crunchy ads, it doesn't make me want to buy one, but it certainly is fun to watch.
How do you do it?
And now we move on to a sweet that I actually do love and is one of Aardman's most popular ads, the Wine Gums Hutsmon ad, which is also known as the ad that spawned one of the most popular catchphrases of the 90s.
Hutsmon, there's juice, loose, about this house.
Well, it was in England anyway. The equivalent of the US would have probably been this.
Nobody better lay a finger on my butterfinger.
And that also had a famous animation studio attached to it, just like this one. This ad shows off something that Aardman doesn't do all that often, having stop motion alongside a human. They did it in the Sledgehammer music video, though I can understand why they didn't do it again that much afterwards, since unlike puppets and other objects, humans involuntarily move a tiny bit even when standing still, so it makes stop motion an even bigger nightmare than it already is. Funnily enough, that moose you see sort of became the mascot for Wine Gums for a bit in the future, so I guess he got tired of flying Dorothy around Oz and decided to get a proper job. Admittedly, the animation in this ad is done very smoothly, and you can't tell of any kind of mistakes that are made or any kind of cheap shortcuts. Well, except for the final shot where the guy dancing is clearly a separate shot over superimposed moving objects, but to be fair, with the amount of moving objects on screen, having to take shots of him alongside them would have been an Everest climbing level ordeal, so I can understand them cheating a little bit there. Still, for a simple concept for an ad, it's a lot of fun, which helps that the music is very catchy, and having stop motion creations keep in time with music is incredibly hard. I mean, having animated characters match time with music in general is very hard, but stop motion especially, and here it lines up perfectly. It's funny just how much effort Aardman puts into their ads. It's actually quite endearing, to be honest, but hey, when these jobs are paying your bills, you might as well make them look good. Maybe I should try that sort of work ethic for my jobs.
Set the juice loose!
And so, we move on to something that Aardman, but above all else, stop motion in general exceeds in, being unintentionally creepy. And being an expert on both of those things, I can say that this one is one of the best examples of both of them. This is an ad that was made to promote the London Film Festival in 1994. Oh, the same year I was born in, there's irony for you. The idea is having an audience of people in the cinema watching films, and the experience of watching them pulls them into a world that is like the film that they're watching. Not the most original idea for a movie ad, but it's always a blast to watch. But I must ask, Aardman, why did you make the audience look like this? Are you trying to say that moviegoers are creepy, ugly monsters? Well, that is definitely true if you go to a midnight screening, but still, these guys just look horrifying, and it really doesn't help the dark set and the creepy music and the sound design. It's just those huge, toothy, ugly grins they have. They freak me out, and this shot doesn't help matters either. Yeah, keep away from me, you weirdos. I don't know if this helped attract people to the festival, but if I saw this ad now, I'd avoid it like the plague. Though to be fair, when you make your own movies, going to a film festival is like its own form of torture, since you spend the whole time comparing the movies you're watching to the kind that you make, and by the end of it, you're more bitter than a rotten cherry mixed with kale. So having this kind of ad for a film festival is sort of fitting for me, since this kind of sums up how I feel when I attend one. But now, let's move on to something that is a little less creepy, but nonetheless just as evil. Insurance companies. In particular, the company known as the National Accident Helpline, and as expected, they advertised the idea of helping out the little guy with their policies. Well, whether that's true or not, that's none of my business, but we're here to talk about the ad, which includes... Oh, hi Rex, haven't seen you in a while. Okay, so that's not Rex the Run, but it's just a separate character who shares a similar design, who this time is voiced by Joe Pasquale.
I went to National Accident Helpline. They're the biggest and the most experienced.
I guess he got lost on his way to Blackpool and then got turned into a dog, but what sort of person could be the complete opposite of his voice to star alongside him in these ads? Well, none other than Brian Blessed, of course.
And I think I should get some compensation.
Don't make me laugh, underdog.
Because the other side pays all the costs.
The other side pays all the costs?
You're not laughing there, are you?
Well, this is a role that certainly fits in better than one of the other Aardman ads he's in. As you'd expect, it's about this little underdog going up to the giant, faceless, nameless insurance guy to get compensation for an accident he's been in, but him refusing, so he decides to go to the NAH. They're rather simple ads, and to be honest, hearing these two polar opposite voices arguing with each other is actually really funny. I always imagine that if Joe and Brian ever screamed at the top of their lungs at the same time, it would shatter the very fabric of existence, but thankfully they don't do that here. The ads did get a bit more elaborate as they went on, even incorporating popular songs and having full-on sets, but they used the guys less, which is a shame, but it is still kind of cool to see Aardman return to these designs again after such a long time. Even if seeing them in the ad is kind of odd, it's still cool to see, since ironically Rex himself was also a bit of an underdog in the Aardman catalogue. Shame we didn't really get to see any more doggy dialogues with these ads though.
Underdog.co.uk.
And so we come to the last part of the video, and since I ended off the last Aardmay with a review of a music video, I feel that it was appropriate to end off this one the same way, and thankfully Aardman has had their hand in making other music videos as well. Last time I talked about one of the biggest and most influential new wave songs of the 80s with one of the most creative, colourful and imaginative music videos of all time. This time we're looking at more or less the exact opposite, with a throwback 70s nostalgia song from 1996 with a very down-to-earth and mostly true to reality music video. Of course, there's still some cartoon elements in there, and has sadly mostly gone forgotten by the general public, but me personally, I think I might actually like this just as much as Sledgehammer. Yes, this time we're talking about Never in Your Wildest Dreams by Tina Turner and Barry White. I will be honest, I'm not the biggest fan of either Turner or White, but they are both very, very good singers and have done some amazing music in the past, and with there being a massive 1970s revival movement in the 90s, and with both them being some of the biggest soul stars of their generation, seems only fitting that they bring us another 70s revival song for the decade. The song is definitely in the vein of seduction and sexual songs in the style of something that Marvin Gaye would do. And it is a very good song in that regard, with lots of lo-fi synthesizer sounds, and of course the amazing bassy voice of Barry White.
I hear people walking, people talking.
But of course, we're not here to talk about the song itself, we're here to talk about the music video. Said music video this time was made by Peter Lord himself, which you can kind of tell because the design of the humans in the video have that slightly more uncanny valley style to them, as opposed to Nick Park's very exaggerated cartoony style. Though in this case that worked out because they're supposed to resemble who the singers actually are, and one drawback with Nick Park's style is that you really can't capture the way people actually look with his style. Admittedly, Lord's style can be a little creepy sometimes, like during the first close-up of Tina Turner's face definitely took me aback a little bit. I was unaware that Tina Turner was a Bratz doll, but you do get used to it, and he is very good with depicting body shapes and having them look both cartoony, but in a weird way somewhat realistic, though that did get him into a bit of trouble with this video, but we'll get into that later. The basic premise of the video is basically Turner and White coming to meet each other in their respective limousines, both of which are insanely huge on the inside, so I guess Aardman is stealing Time Lord technology again, and are just going through their regular routine, or preparing themselves to get ready to meet the other one. One of which being that apparently Tina Turner likes to knit. And I mean, seriously likes to knit. She basically does nothing else throughout the entire video, which I will admit is actually kind of funny, that the idea that Tina Turner loves knitting, and apparently the inside of her limousine has enough space to accommodate an entire walk-in wardrobe and a swarm of paparazzi, which you would think that the chauffeur wouldn't have allowed them in the first place, but whatever. There's even a bar in there with a stage including some very familiar cameos, and one not so familiar cameo. If you can't tell, that's supposed to be Antonio Banderas, who is there because he also did a version of this song with Tina Turner. I do wonder which one he prefers, this animated rendition of him or the version of him that shows him as a cat who wears nothing but a hat and boots. Barry White, on the other hand, has a much more laid-back approach to when he's approaching, which makes sense because that's more of the kind of person he is, such as getting a massage from what looks like a cartoon version of Mickey Rooney's character from Breakfast at Tiffany's. Not sure whose idea that was, but evidently it's not something you'd be able to get away with these days. Having a bath and ironing his shirts. When I say this, it kind of makes me think we're actually watching an old Marlon Brando here. Speaking of which, there is a little bit of controversy with this video, and no, it's not because of Barry White's masseuse in the video. See, when the video was finished and made, apparently Tina Turner loved it, but Barry White hated it, and the big reason for that is because they felt they were making fun of his weight in the video. I can certainly understand his mentality there, especially since the model in which they gave to his caricature is not a very flattering kind of size and shape, and it's probably made worse by the fact that how Tina Turner's caricature, despite having a very odd looking face, does look unbelievably sexy. So I guess I was wrong, it is possible to do that. And this probably isn't helped by the fact that at the time this video was made, both of them would have been in their 50s at the time. However, despite one moment near the end of the video with Tina Turner giving him the jumper that she's been making throughout the video being way too small for him, which I saw more as that she just wasn't very good at getting the measurements down, less about them making fun of his actual size, and the very unflattering size and shape of his model, I personally think they were actually quite respectful to White. They don't do any cheap jokes with his weight, like having him step into his limousine and having the rear fender scraping against the road or anything, or when he gets into his bath having all the water flow out like it's a tsunami. They actually treated him with quite a great deal of respect. Now, of course, I myself am not Barry White, more's the pity because I would love his voice. So if he felt he was misrepresented in the video, that is kind of a shame, though if the ghost of Barry White just happens to be listening, I do just want to say this: you looked better fat, if I'm honest. You looked more cuddly and welcoming. When you were skinny, you looked rather creepy. I get the feeling that when I die, Barry White is not exactly going to be giving me the best reception when I arrive in heaven. Regardless of that, this actually is a really cool and funny music video. Not to mention the depiction of a much more American style cityscape and the style of music reminded me a lot of the movie Chuck Steel, especially with this presumably being set in LA, though the group of hookers is a little bit head tilting. Granted, it could be argued that this video was not intended to be seen by children, but still I think it's a little bit iffy. It does have a much more straightforward and simple premise compared to other Aardman music videos, as well as the visuals for that matter, but they do fit with this kind of music, and despite that, it is still very creative and has a lot of imagination to it, even with its simple premise. And that just goes to show how much Aardman can show its creativity, even in something that has such a simple premise, which in many ways kind of sums up the way Aardman are in general. Very simple ideas, but made in a very creative way. And we've seen that countless times over the last few years since I've been doing these Aardman videos, from movies, TV shows, TV commercials, and music videos. They've been able to bring us some of the most imaginative, charming, and simply just enjoyable stop motion projects that I have ever seen and have ever been made, period. And that brings us not only to the end of this year's Aardmay, but Aardmay in general, since there really isn't much left for me to talk about in terms of this company. If there is enough stuff that may be brought out in the future, I may return to this another time, but for now, we have come to the end of Aardmay. One hell of a journey it's been, I can tell you that. But onwards and upwards to the next review, and I'll see you then. Goodbye.